Keith Richards, inarguably one of the most recognizable figures in music history, doesn't just play rock and roll, he is rock and roll.
I know who I am, but I realise that people think Keith Richards is, smoking a joint, bottle in his hand, cursing the fact that the liquor store's closed.
From his staggering riffs to his devil-may-care lifestyle, there's no separating the man from the genre he helped define. He's lived through more disasters, both self-inflicted and accidental, than most of us can imagine, and, at 80, still looks like he could light a cigarette, plug in his Telecaster, and outlast you in an all-night jam session. But beneath the layers of well-worn leather, the endless cigarette smoke, and a grin that suggests he's been let in on a joke no one else will ever understand, lies something many forget about Keith Richards. He's a deeply opinionated man.
Don't suddenly go into hibernation. I was itching to get back in the studio and cut a couplet.
Now, rock and roll is a genre that, by its very nature, attracts egos the size of stadiums. But Richards isn't simply your run-of-the-mill rock star with a god complex and a taste for debauchery. He's also a self-appointed arbiter of what constitutes real music, which, as it turns out, makes him one of the most entertaining and scathing critics of his own peers.
It was a lot more vibrant. It was rocking when I got here. I remember that. It's leaving. I don't remember.
Richards has made a habit of issuing brutally honest assessments of other musicians over the years, often to the delight of fans and the dismay of his contemporaries.
I used to hang with John off and on quite a bit, and he was outrageous. I mean, he was just a beautiful spirit, you know. I mean, he certainly didn't deserve that, you know.
Whether it's picking apart the shortcomings of their live performances, dismissing their songwriting outright, or just poking fun at their aesthetic choices, Richards has never shied away from telling us exactly what he thinks. And if there's one thing he truly can't abide, it's what he sees as pretentiousness. For Keith, rock and roll should be raw, spontaneous, and real, not an overproduced, navel-gazing spectacle that he feels misses the point entirely. Of course, this penchant for critique has ruffled feathers over the years, particularly among the titans of rock who have found themselves in his firing line. In a world where musicians often sing each other's praises in public while perhaps harboring private grudges, Richards' lack of filter is refreshingly, and often hilariously, candid. The man has been unapologetically blunt for decades, which is why revisiting his colorful critiques of 5 legendary bands offers not just a window into his worldview, but a reminder of the contradictions and quirks that make him such a compelling figure. He may be a lover of blues, a man who worships the dirt under the fingernails of rock and roll, but he's never been shy about taking down those he feels haven't upheld the spirit of the genre, and, in true Richards fashion, he doesn't do it quietly. Let's start with the band. On paper, this is a group that seems tailor-made for Richards' approval. Their back-to-basics ethos, combined with a mastery of blues, folk, and rock, would appear to align perfectly with Keith's own sensibilities. And yet, even here, the man finds something to criticize. His issues with the band go back to 1966, when Bob Dylan, another artist he's taken digs at over the years, declared that his then backing group, the Hawks, later the band, were better than the Stones. That particular slight seems to have lodged itself firmly in Keith's memory, because 3 years later, after witnessing their iconic performance with Dylan at the Isle of Wight Festival, he wasn't singing their praises. Instead, Richards made it clear that while Dylan himself was beautiful, he found the band to be disappointingly rigid. They've been playing together for a long, long time, and what I couldn't understand was their lack of spontaneity, he said. They sounded note for note like their records. They just didn't seem to come alive by themselves. For Keith, this kind of precision was an affront to the very essence of live music. A performance, in his mind, should be a living, breathing thing, unpredictable, raw, and above all, electric. The band's meticulous replication of their studio sound left him cold, as though he were watching a beautifully crafted piece of machinery, rather than a group of musicians bearing their souls on stage. His verdict? They were essentially an accompanying band, and with that, one of the most revered acts of the era was summarily dismissed.
And they're walking off stage, we're standing there, and like, Mick and Keith, like, they go like, he walks off before the end of the song. They're like, Bob Dylan! And he turns around and he looks at them and he goes, F you, like this, and he gives them the finger, and like, I'm like, it's the best concert I've ever seen in my life. It's incredible. And Keith, I can see Keith goes, "Oh, don't be like that, Bob."
Next, we come to Credence Clearwater Revival, a band whose swampy, southern-tinged rock captured the spirit of America's heartland, despite the fact that they hailed from California. Their ability to distill the essence of Americana into tracks like Green River and Born on the Bayou made them one of the most beloved acts of their generation. For a brief moment, it seemed they had managed to charm even Keith Richards. "When I first heard them, I was really knocked out," he admitted. But, as is often the case with Keith, the honeymoon period didn't last. "I became bored with them very quickly. After a few times, it started to annoy me. They're so basic and simple that maybe it's a little too much." Now, it's worth noting that Richards has always been drawn to simplicity in music, but it has to be the right kind of simplicity. The stripped-down grooves of Muddy Waters or Chuck Berry. Perfect. The structured, polished songs of Credence. Apparently, not so much. To Keith, the magic of rock and roll lies in its imperfections, its rough edges. Credence Clearwater Revival, with their clean, carefully crafted sound, may have been too neat and tidy to hold his interest. For someone who thrives on the chaos of a Rolling Stones show, where every night is a high-wire act of musical alchemy, Credence likely felt too predictable, too safe.
Some things I liked about it, some I didn't, yeah.
But if Richards' criticisms of the band and Credence seem relatively mild, his assessment of the Grateful Dead is downright scornful. This is a band whose reputation as the ultimate purveyors of the freewheeling, drug-fueled 1960s lifestyle should, in theory, make them kindred spirits to the man who turned excess into an art form. And yet, Richards has never been a fan. In fact, he's been openly hostile toward the Dead's penchant for endless live jams and psychedelic improvisation. "The Grateful Dead is where everybody got it wrong," he said in 2015, pulling no punches. "Just poodling about for hours and hours. Jerry Garcia, boring shit, man. Sorry, Jerry." For Keith, the Dead's sprawling, meandering performances represent the antithesis of what rock and roll should be. He values conciseness, the ability to deliver a punchy, emotionally charged performance that grabs the audience and doesn't let go. The Dead's seemingly endless detours into musical experimentation, on the other hand, left him cold. While their fans might revel in the transcendent communal experience of a 3-hour jam session, Richards saw it as little more than self-indulgence. It's perhaps not surprising, then, that Guns N' Roses also earned his ire. At first glance, you might think Richards would find some common ground with the Los Angeles band, given their rebellious image and raucous energy. But Keith being Keith, he found something to gripe about. "I admire their guts," he conceded, but that's where the compliments ended. Their look, it's like there's one out of this band, one looks like Jimmy Page, one looks like Ronnie Wood. Too much copycat, too much posing for me. And there it is, the unforgivable crime of imitation. For Richards, Guns N' Roses' aesthetic choices came across as an exercise in mimicry, a calculated attempt to capitalize on the legacy of older, more authentic bands. And then, of course, there's Led Zeppelin. If there's one band whose larger-than-life presence might seem to rival the Stones, it's Zeppelin. With their thunderous sound, virtuosic musicianship, and larger-than-life personalities, they set a new standard for what a rock band could be. But while Richards has expressed admiration for Jimmy Page's guitar playing, his feelings about the band as a whole are far less glowing. "I love Jimmy," he said, in what might be the closest thing to a compliment we'll get. "But as a band, no. With John Bonham thundering down the highway in an uncontrolled 18-wheeler. He paused, leaving the image to speak for itself. And as for Robert Plant's iconic vocals, the guy's voice started to get on my nerves. I don't know why. Maybe he's a little too acrobatic.
As a band, I felt that, aptly named, it never took off for me musically. At the same time, Jimmy Page is one of the best guitar players I've ever known.
For Richards, Zeppelin's sound, with its epic solos and high-octane theatrics, lacked the grounded, gritty authenticity that he cherishes. While millions of fans were losing themselves in the band's sonic grandeur, Keith was rolling his eyes. Richards' critiques, while often biting, reveal as much about him as they do about the bands he's criticizing. He's a man who has spent his life chasing the essence of rock and roll, and he's never been afraid to call out what he sees as deviations from its core principles. For Keith, music isn't about perfection or spectacle. It's about raw emotion, spontaneity, and honesty. Whether you agree with him or not, there's something undeniably compelling about his unvarnished perspective. After all, in a world where so many artists tread carefully, afraid to offend, Keith Richards is still unapologetically Keith, and that's why we love him.